Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 1. Matthew Cuthbert lived with his sister Marilla on their farm on Prince Edward Island, Canada. Their farmhouse, Green Gables, was just outside the small village of Avonlea. Matthew was almost 60 years old. He was 5 years older than his sister. Both were tall and thin. Matthew had a long brown beard. He wasn't very talkative. Marilla, on the other hand, always had a serious look. She rarely laughed. However, everyone in Avonlea knew that the Cuthberts were hard-working and kind people. One afternoon, Matthew rode to the station in a carriage. "Hasn't the 5:30 train arrived yet?" he asked the station master. "Yes, it has arrived," the man replied, "and there is a passenger waiting for you, a little girl." "A little girl?" asked Matthew. "But a boy was supposed to come. The children's home would send us one of the orphan boys. We will adopt him, and he will help me with the farm work." "Well, maybe there were no boys in the children's home, so they sent you a girl," the station master replied carelessly. "Look, she's here." Matthew turned to talk to her. The girl was about 10 or 11 years old, and her long red hair was in 2 braids. Her face was small, white, and thin. She had lots of freckles and big green eyes. She was wearing an old brown hat and a dress that was too small for her. "Are you Mr. Cuthbert of Green Gables?" she asked excitedly. "I am very, very happy to be living with you. I've never had a home or family to which I belong. I am grateful to you." Matthew felt sorry for the girl. How could he tell her that everything was a mistake? But he couldn't just leave her at the station. He decided to take her home. Maybe Marilla could explain the situation to her. Matthew was surprised that the little girl was enjoying the journey home. She was looking around cheerfully and was always talking about something. This girl seemed interesting to him, as he was generally a quiet man. He listened to her all the way. The little girl told everything about herself. "My parents died when I was a baby. In the last 3 years, I have lived with 3 different families and looked after their children. I was always poor and never had a nice dress. But sometimes I dream that I am wearing a beautiful blue dress, a big hat full of flowers, and blue shoes, and I feel happy. Do you dream of such things from time to time?" Matthew looked sideways at her and smiled, but he didn't answer. They were passing apple trees on the side of the road. The trees were filled with sweet-smelling, snow-white flowers. The little girl looked at them. "Aren't the trees beautiful?" she said happily. "They smell good." "What trees are these?" she asked. Then she shyly said, "Excuse me, I am talking too much. Please tell me. I'll shut up if necessary." Matthew smiled at her. "You keep talking," he said. "Those fragrant trees are apple trees," he replied. Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 2. When they arrived in Green Gables, Marilla came to the door to greet them. But when she saw the little girl, she asked in surprise, "Matthew, who is this girl? Where is the boy?" "The children's home has made a mistake," he said. "They sent a girl, not a boy." "Good God, how could they make such a mistake?" said Marilla. The girl was listening to them intently. She was very upset by all this. She put her head in her hands and began to cry. You don't want me," she sobbed. "You don't want me because I'm not a boy." "Don't cry," said Marilla gently. "No, I want to cry. This is the worst thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life." Matthew approached her and tapped her on the shoulder. "Please, don't cry," he said. Then Marilla said, "You can stay here tonight. Come on, let's go inside." She asked the girl for her name. The child stopped crying. "Please call me Cordelia," she said. "You want us to call you Cordelia? Is that your real name?" "Well, no, but it's a beautiful name, isn't it? I like to imagine my name is Cordelia because my real name is Anne Shirley. Not a very interesting name, is it?" Marilla shook her head. "The child has too much imagination," she thought. They ate dinner together. During the meal, the girl told various stories that happened to her. Some amused Matthew, but Marilla was cold to the girl. After dinner, the girl said she was tired and went to sleep. Marilla and Matthew washed the dishes together and talked. "She has to go back to the children's home tomorrow," Marilla told her brother. "Marilla, I don't know. Don't you think?" Matthew began. "Isn't she a very smart and interesting kid?" "Matthew Cuthbert, are you telling me you want to adopt her?" asked Marilla. "Why not?" said Matthew calmly. "But we don't need a girl." "But maybe she needs us," replied Matthew with surprising speed for him. "She's had a very unhappy life up until now, Marilla. She can help you at home. I can arrange for a boy from the village to help me on the farm. What do you say?" Marilla thought for a long time. "Okay," she said at last. "I agree. Poor kid can stay. I'll look after her." Matthew smiled happily. "Be as good and kind to her as you can, Marilla. I think she needs a lot of love." The next morning, Marilla told Anne at breakfast, "Matthew and I have decided to adopt you if you become a good girl." She thought she would be delighted with the news, but Anne suddenly began to cry. "What's the matter, kid? What's the matter? Why are you crying now?" "I'm crying," sobbed Anne, "because I'm so happy. This place is so beautiful. People say I am bad, but I will work hard to be good. Oh, thanks, thanks." "Now stop crying, child," said Marilla, a little crossly, "and listen. We're going to adopt you and send you to school after the summer break." Anne stopped crying. "May I call you Aunt Marilla? I've never had a family, so I would love to have an aunt. Maybe we can imagine you're my mother's sister." "No," replied Marilla firmly. "Why? Don't you ever dream of anything?" asked Anne, surprised. "No, I do not know," replied Marilla. "I do my chores, look after Matthew, and go to church on Sunday. There is no time to imagine things in this house." Anne was silent for a few moments. Then she said, "Marilla, do you think I can find a good friend in Avonlea? Someone who truly understands me and knows all my secrets. I've always wanted a friend like that." Our friends, the Berries, have a daughter about your age named Diana, but if you want to play with her, you have to be very good. Mrs. Berry is very picky about Diana's friends."
"Diana! What a beautiful name!" said Anne excitedly. "Is her hair red?" "I hope not." She looked sadly at her red braids. "I hate my hair."
"Diana has dark hair. She's a good, smart girl. Try to be like her, Anne." Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 3. When the two girls met, they quickly realized that they would become good friends. They often played together in the field, by the river, or in the garden. In the mornings, Anne was helping Marilla with the housework. In the afternoon, she was playing with Diana or chatting with Matthew while he worked on the farm. Anne soon knew and loved every flower, tree, and animal in Green Gables. The Cuthberts had another friend, Mrs. Rachel Lynde. She liked to know everything that was going on in and around Avonlea. She was very interested in the Cuthberts' little orphan daughter, so she visited Marilla one day. "I was very surprised when I heard about the girl," she said to Marilla. "So, you and Matthew adopted her." "I am surprised, too," replied Marilla, smiling. "But she is a very smart and cute girl. She's always dancing, singing, or laughing." Mrs. Lynde shook her head sadly. "What a mistake, Marilla. You never had a child. How are you going to take care of her?" Just then, Anne ran into the room. She stopped suddenly when she saw this strange lady in the kitchen. Mrs. Lynde looked at this thin little girl with a short dress, freckled face, and red hair. "Isn't she too thin, Marilla?" she asked. "Look at those freckles, and hair as red as a carrot." Anne's face went red. She was very embarrassed and angry. She walked over to Mrs. Lynde. "I hate you!" she shouted at her angrily. "You are a scary, fat, old woman!" she said, and ran upstairs. Mrs. Lynde nearly fell out of her chair in surprise. "Oh, my God!" she said. "What a terrible girl! I wish you patience, Marilla." Marilla was also very surprised, and she couldn't say anything at that moment. But this woman's knowing comments bothered her, too. She would never compromise on Anne. "But you were mean to her, too, Rachel," replied Marilla. Mrs. Lynde tried to be indifferent when she saw Marilla defending the little girl. "Well, then," she said. She got up and walked to the door. "I think this orphan is more important to you than me. We've been friends for a long time. You're going to get in trouble with her. You are making a big mistake." After she left, Marilla sat for a short while in the garden, and when she felt ready, she went up to Anne's room. She knocked on the door and went in. The child was lying face down in her bed, crying. "You shouldn't be so angry, Anne. Mrs. Lynde is my friend, and you were very rude to her," she said. "She was mean to me, too," said Anne. "She said I was thin and freckled and red-headed. She was so rude." "I understand how you feel," said Marilla, "but you should go to her and tell her you're sorry." "I would never do that," said Anne firmly. Then you should stay in your room and think about it. Once you agree to say you are sorry, you can go out." Anne stayed in her room all day. The downstairs was very quiet without her. That evening, while Marilla was busy in the garden, Matthew went up to Anne's room. The girl was sitting by the window and looked unhappy. "Anne," he said shyly, "why are you so sad? Come on, tell me."
"That woman said bad things to me. Besides, I didn't do anything to her. Do you know what she said?"
"Yes, Marilla mentioned it," he said, and smiled. "You shouldn't take Mrs. Lynde seriously, because I think your freckles suit you very well. Also, your hair color is beautiful." Anne became very happy. It was so nice to hear this. She hugged Matthew and said to him,
"Thank you. I feel much better now."
Matthew hugged her too. He was happy that he could cheer her up.
"Do you really want me to apologize to that woman?" Anne asked.
"Yes, please. Will you do this?"
"Okay," said the little girl. "I will apologize to her."
The next day, Marilla and Anne went to Mrs. Lynde's house. Marilla had been glad when Anne came up to her last night and said she was sorry, but she was a little nervous now, because sometimes Anne did such things that she was astonished. They knocked on the door. Mrs. Lynde opened it, but she wasn't smiling. She invited them in. Marilla was about to talk about how upset Anne was when Anne suddenly fell to her knees.
"Oh, Mrs. Lynde!" she cried. "I am really sad. I can't describe to you how sorry I am, so you just have to imagine. I'm a bad girl. Please forgive me."
The two women looked at Anne in surprise. "She is having fun," thought Marilla, looking into Anne's face. "She doesn't look sad at all. She's very happy and excited." But Mrs. Lynde believed she was sincere. "Of course I forgive you," she said gently. She liked this exaggerated apology. "Perhaps you did well to adopt her," she said to Marilla. "She's a weird little girl, but I think I'm starting to like her." Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 4. Schools opened in September, and Anne and Diana walked to school together every day. One morning, while the two friends were walking in the field, Anne said happily,
"What a beautiful day. I'm so lucky to have you as my friend, Diana. You're my best friend, aren't you?"
"Of course, Anne," Diana replied, taking Anne's hand and looking affectionately at her. Then she continued, "You know, there's a very handsome boy at school. His name is Gilbert Blythe. Maybe you'll meet him today. He is 3 years older than us."
"Oh, boys," said Anne. "I am not interested in them."
The school was not very crowded. Diana introduced her to some of her friends. They entered the classroom. They sat side by side in a row. Then Diana whispered, "Anne, look to your left. There's Gilbert. He's sitting by the window. See?" Anne turned that way she saw a tall boy with curly brown hair. He had a nice smile. Just then, Gilbert also looked at Anne and smiled at her. Anne immediately turned away. "But why is he smiling at me? He doesn't know me," she thought. The teacher, Mr. Phillips, was very tough. According to him, the most important task of a student was to study and obey the school rules. All students had to sit in silence while he was in the classroom. Anne was a little nervous when she first saw him, but within a few days she got used to it. That day, Anne was sitting on her desk by the window, watching. She was looking at the red and yellow leaves of the trees and the silvery blue of the river. She didn't even realize that Gilbert was trying to get her attention. "Hey, Anne," he whispered. Anne did not look at him. The boy was surprised because often girls looked at him. He suddenly reached out and pulled at her red braids, and in a loud whisper, "Carrots!" he said. "Carrots!" Anne sprang to her feet and looked angrily at Gilbert. "You mean kid!" she cried. "How dare you talk to me like that?" Then she lowered her heavy book on Gilbert's head. Meanwhile, the other children began to laugh as well. Mr. Phillips heard the noise and rushed over to them. "Anne Shirley, why did you do this?" he asked. Anne didn't say anything. "I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips," Gilbert said. "It's my fault. I was rude to her. That's why she hit me." But the teacher did not listen to Gilbert. "There is no room for bad students at my school," Mr. Phillips said. "Anne, go and stand in front of the board." Anne did as the teacher said. She stood there for the rest of the day. She felt angry, sad, and wronged. "I hate Mr. Phillips," she thought, "and I will never look at or speak to Gilbert Blythe again." At noon the next day, some boys from school were playing in a farmer's field. Anne joined them. They didn't realize how time passed. They were late for class. Anne and the others entered the classroom at the same time. The teacher had already started the lesson. The children took their seats immediately. Anne was just about to sit down when Mr. Phillips said, "You're late, Anne. You will not sit down with Diana today. I see you really like playing with the boys. So go sit next to Gilbert this afternoon." Anne's face turned white. "Why is he only punishing me?" she thought. "Did you hear me, Anne?" asked Mr. Phillips. "Yes, sir, I heard," she said, and slowly made her way over to Gilbert's desk. She sat there and put her hands on the table and laid her head on the table. "This is too much," she thought. "I wasn't the only one late, and he made me sit side by side with a boy, and that boy is Gilbert Blythe." That afternoon seemed too long to Anne. Time did not pass. When it was time to go home, she went to her desk next to Diana and put all her books and pencils in her bag. "What are you doing, Anne?" Diana asked. "I will not go back to school again," said Anne firmly. "Ah, but Anne, we're going to read a new book next week and learn a new game on Monday." But Anne was not interested. Her only answer was, "I'm sorry, Diana." Marilla was preparing something in the kitchen when she got home. After Anne said "hello" to her in a bad mood, she went to her room. Marilla realized that something was wrong. She followed her upstairs. "What's going on, Anne?" she asked. Anne told her that from tomorrow on she would never go to school again. "But why?" asked Marilla. "Because I don't think school is for me, and I don't want to talk about it any more." Marilla stood there for a while in amazement. Then she thought of going to Rachel Lynde's house. She had many children. She could help her with that. She immediately took a shawl over and went out. It was already dark. When Mrs. Lynde opened the door for her, she met Marilla's sad face. "Rachel, please help me. Anne says she won't be going back to school. What am I going to do now?" she asked. Mrs. Lynde already knew about Anne's troubles at school and was always very pleased when people asked for her help. She smiled and invited Marilla to the warm fireplace. "You know, I have 5 kids, and it wasn't easy raising them, Marilla," she said. "I know you're upset right now, but you should give Anne time. If you force her to go to school, everything could be worse." "So what should I do, Rachel? Just let her sit at home?" "Yes, don't worry. You'll see. After a while, she'll get bored and want to go back to school." So Marilla and Matthew let Anne not go to school for a while. Diana and Anne could only see each other in the evening. Some evenings, Diana stayed at home because she had homework. Anne hated days like this because she loved her friend so much. One evening, Marilla found Anne crying in the kitchen. "What's the matter, my child?" she asked in surprise. Anne cried, "I can't see Diana like we used to. She is my dearest friend, and I miss her," she said. "You can meet more often if you go back to school," said Marilla. Anne continued to cry and said, "But Marilla, you don't understand. What happens when Diana gets married? I already hate her husband. I can picture her at church in her long white dress, but then she'll walk away, and I will never see her again." Marilla tried not to laugh, but she couldn't help herself. She turned her back so that Anne wouldn't see it. "You and your imagination, Anne Shirley," she laughed. What a strange, funny child Anne was. After a week, Mrs. Lynde was right. Anne decided to go back to school. Diana was the happiest. The other kids in the class were also happy to see Anne again. One of these children was Gilbert, but he did not dare speak to Anne because he knew she hated him. Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 5. Time passed. Anne got used to the school and began to do well in her studies. Marilla and Matthew were quite happy with this situation. Seeing Anne as cheerful as before made them happy, too. One day Marilla asked Anne, "Do you know the new priest and his wife in the village?" "Mr. and Mrs. Allen? Yes, I met them," said Anne. "I will invite them for tea on Wednesday." "It would be great!" cried Anne excitedly. "Mrs. Allen is young and beautiful. She has such a sweet smile. Can I make a cake to eat with tea?
Please say yes, Marilla." Marilla agreed, and Anne planned what to put in her cake for the next few days. The tea party on Wednesday started off very well. Mrs. Allen told Marilla, "This is a beautiful cake. You've worked hard." "Anne made this specially for you, Mrs. Allen," replied Marilla. "Then I have to taste some," laughed the priest's wife. But after the first bite, a very strange expression formed on her face. "Is there a problem?" asked Marilla. She ate a piece of Anne's cake herself. "Ah, Anne, what did you put in this cake?" she cried. "Oh, wasn't it nice?" Anne asked, and her face reddened. "It is terrible. Don't try to eat any more, Mrs. Allen. I think Anne put some of my medicine in this cake." "Ah, I did not know. It was white in color and was in a bottle." "I thought it was milk," said Anne. She ran upstairs and threw herself on her bed, crying loudly. Later that evening, when Mr. and Mrs. Allen went home, Marilla went up to her room to talk to her. "Oh, Marilla!" cried Anne. "Everyone in Avonlea will laugh at me for putting medicine in the cake." Marilla laughed and patted Anne's head. "No, they will not laugh. Anyway, Mrs. Allen wasn't angry either. She was very happy that you made a cake for her. She invited you to tea at her house, too." "Oh, so she forgave me. I'm so glad," said Anne gratefully. "Why do I always make mistakes? I hope I don't make any mistakes tomorrow." Marilla shook her head, smiling. "You'll find something, Anne. You are very good at making mistakes." Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 6. Spring arrived with its bright green leaves and early blooms. One April evening, Marilla came home late after visiting her friends. She found the kitchen empty, and there was no dinner on the table. "Where is Anne?" she thought. "I told her to prepare dinner." She hurried to Anne's room, knocked on the door, and entered. She didn't see anyone. "So strange," she thought. "Where is this girl?" At that moment, a voice came. "I'm here, under the bed," said Anne. Marilla turned in the direction of the voice. "For God's sake, what are you doing under the bed, Anne? Get out of there." "I will, but you won't be mad at me," said Anne. "Promise?" "Okay," said Marilla. Anne slowly crawled out from under the bed. Marilla froze at what she saw. Anne's long, thick, red hair had turned dark green. Only a small place in the upper part was still red. It looked terrible. "Oh, Anne, what did you do to your hair?" said Marilla. I bought a bottle of hair dye from a man who came to the door. He said it would turn my hair from red to black. Oh, I know that was so stupid, but what am I going to do now?" They washed Anne's hair many times, but it was still green. Anne stayed at home for a week, did not see anyone, and washed her hair every day. But the result did not change. At the end of that week, Marilla said, "Sorry, Anne, we're going to have to cut it all out. You can't go to school with green hair." Anne had to accept. "Maybe that will teach me not to think about being beautiful,"
she said sadly. She went to school for the first time that morning with her short hair, but luckily it didn't turn out as she feared. Her friends were surprised to see her like that, but no one made fun of her. A few weeks later, new, darker red curls appeared, and they delighted Anne very much. 3 months later, schools closed, and summer vacation began. Anne now had longer and thicker hair. That summer, Anne and her friends often went to the riverside. There was an old boat, and they liked to play with it. The imaginative Anne told her friends, "Let's pretend I'm a prisoner and I escaped from prison in this boat." And she added, "I'm going to hide under that cover on the boat. The river will carry the boat to the bridge. You are my family, and you will meet me at the bridge." The girls looked at each other. "Okay," they said, even though the idea of Anne alone in a rowboat on the river seemed strange to them. Anne got into the boat and hid under the covers. Her friends pushed the boat down the river and ran over the fields to reach the bridge. The prisoner enjoyed the game for a few moments, but then, suddenly, she got wet and straightened up. Water was rushing in through a hole in the bottom of the boat. Luckily, there were trees by the river, and Anne saw a low branch above the water. She jumped to her feet and grabbed the branch. The boat continued without her. The girls waiting on the bridge saw the boat, but it was half full with water and was about to sink. Anne was nowhere to be seen. They panicked. They called out to Anne several times, but there was no answer. They rushed to the village to call for help. Poor Anne just hung on the branch she was holding on to. Her arms were starting to get tired. River water was running under her, and she knew she would fall in a minute. Suddenly, she saw Gilbert Blythe. He was coming towards her in another boat. She never thought she would be so happy to see him. "Anne Shirley!" he cried. "What are you doing there?" Without waiting for an answer, he quickly helped Anne into the boat. Anne didn't say a word. She was grateful to him, but she quietly waited to come ashore. When they got to the bridge, she got off and turned to Gilbert. "Thank you for helping me," she said, in a cold voice. But suddenly, Gilbert grabbed her by the arm. "Anne," he said quickly, "I'm so sorry I called you Carrot. Your hair is so beautiful right now. Will you forgive me? Can we be friends now?" Anne wanted to say yes for a moment. It was very nice of Gilbert to save her and apologize to her. But then she remembered how embarrassed she had been standing in front of the class all afternoon because of him. No, she could never forgive him. "No," she said, "I will never be friends with you, Gilbert Blythe." "Well," said Gilbert angrily, and jumped into his boat, "then I will never ask again." Anne walked home with her head held high, but felt strangely sad and wanted to cry. When she heard of Anne's adventure, Marilla asked, "Why are you always in trouble, Anne?" "Well, I guess that's how I learn, Marilla," replied Anne. "I learn from my mistakes, and I won't be using my imagination much after today. I don't think Avonlea is the right place for imagination." "No, it is not," said Marilla. When Marilla came out of the room, Matthew, sitting quietly in his corner, whispered to Anne, "Have some imagination, Anne, but not much, just a little." Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 7. 3 years passed. Anne had grown a little. Her teacher, Mrs. Stacy, thought Anne would make a good teacher. That's why she invited Marilla to school. Marilla said, "Anne, your new teacher, Mrs. Stacy, spoke to me yesterday. She says you should study for the Queen's College exams in 2 years. If you're successful, you can study for a year at Queen's College in Charlottetown and become a teacher after that."
"Oh, Marilla, I would love to be a teacher, but wouldn't that be too expensive?"
"Don't worry about money, Anne," she said. "When Matthew and I adopted you, we decided to take care of you as best as we could. Of course, we will pay for your education." Anne thanked Marilla and hugged her tightly. Marilla hugged her too. She thought how much she loved Anne. Anne and some of her friends were leaving school late in the afternoons now, and Mrs. Stacy was helping them prepare for the exam. Diana didn't want to go to Queen's College, so she was coming home early, but Gilbert was staying at school. He and Anne were still not speaking. Everyone knew they were enemies because they both wanted to be first in the exam. In her heart, Anne was upset that she and Gilbert weren't friends, but it was too late. Anne studied hard at school for 2 years. She loved to learn, and Mrs. Stacy was very pleased with her. During her break from work, she was visiting friends on the weekends, walking in the fields with Diana, or chatting with Matthew. "Anne is a big girl now. She is taller than you," said Rachel Lynde to Marilla one day. "You're right, Rachel," said Marilla in surprise. "And she's such a good girl now, isn't she? She's not much in trouble these days. I'm sure she helps you a lot with the housework, too." "Yes, I don't know what I would do without her," said Marilla, smiling. "Those beautiful gray eyes and that reddish-brown hair. You know, Marilla, I thought you and Matthew made a mistake when you adopted her, but now I see that I was wrong. You took such good care of her." "Thanks, Rachel," replied Marilla happily. That evening, when Matthew entered the kitchen, he saw his sister crying. "What is the problem?" he asked in surprise. "I was just thinking about Anne," said Marilla. I'll miss her when she's gone." "You mean when she goes to Queen's College?" "Yes, but on the weekends she can come home by train." "I will still miss her," said Marilla sadly. In June, students at Avonlea had to go to Charlottetown to take their exams. When she was back in Green Gables, Anne said to Diana,
"Oh, I hope I've been successful. The exams were very difficult, and I have to wait 3 weeks to learn the result. 3 weeks! I'll die!"
Anne wanted to score higher than Gilbert, but she also wanted to do well for Matthew and Marilla. This was very important to her. Diana was the first to hear the news. She ran to the kitchen of the Green Gables farm and said, "Look, Anne, it's in my dad's newspaper. You're number 1 among Gilbert and all the students on the island. Oh, how wonderful!" With trembling hands, Anne took the paper and saw her name at the top of the list of 200. She couldn't speak. "I knew it," said Matthew with a warm smile. Secretly overjoyed, Marilla said, "Good job, I have to admit, Anne." For the next 3 weeks, Anne and Marilla were very busy. Anne needed new clothes to take to Charlottetown. The evening before she left, she wore one of her new dresses to show Matthew. Marilla watched her happy, youthful face. She remembered the strange, skinny little girl from 5 years ago and began to cry silently. "Marilla, why are you crying?" Anne asked. "I was thinking about when you were a little girl," said Marilla. "And now you're leaving. I'll be alone without you." Anne took Marilla's face in her hands. "Marilla, nothing will change. Maybe I've grown up now and will continue to grow, but I'll always be your little Anne. I will love you and Matthew and Green Gables more every day of my life," she said. Marilla couldn't express her feelings like Anne, but she could show them. She wrapped her arms around her and hugged her tightly. Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 8. So, the next year, Anne lived in Charlottetown and went to college every day. Sometimes she would come home on the weekends, but she had to study hard. Some of her Avonlea friends, and even her enemy, Gilbert Blythe, were also at Queen's College. Anne often saw him walking and talking to other girls. She actually knew that she and Gilbert could get along well, but she didn't want to be the first to talk to him, and she wasn't looking at him at all. In the college, there were exams in May. Anne studied hard for her exams. "I would love to get the first place," she thought. "Or maybe I can get the Avery Award." It was an award given to students who were best at writing in English, and Anne knew she was good at it. The Avery Award provided 4 years of scholarship at Redmond College, one of Canada's top schools. While Anne was walking around in the schoolyard, she heard shouts. "Gilbert! The first is Gilbert!" For a moment, she felt bad. But just then, she heard another shout. "And Anne Shirley has won the Avery Award!" And then all the girls surrounded her. They were congratulating Anne and laughing merrily. "Matthew and Marilla will be delighted," thought Anne. "Now I can keep studying, and they won't have to pay any more." But when she got back to Green Gables, Anne knew right away that something was wrong. Matthew looked much older than before. "What's wrong with him?" she asked to Marilla. "He's had some heart issues this year," replied Marilla. "He isn't good at all. I am worrying about him." "You don't look well either, Marilla," said Anne. "Now you should rest while I do the housework." Marilla smiled wearily at Anne. "It's not because of work. I have a headache. The back of my eyes often hurts. I need to see a doctor as soon as possible. Anyway, Anne, have you heard of a church bank?" "Yeah, I heard the bank is going through tough times." "All our money is in that bank. I know Matthew is worried about that." The next morning, Matthew received a letter. Marilla saw his sullen face, and, "What happened, Matthew?" she asked. Bringing an armful of flowers into the kitchen, Anne saw his face too. Matthew suddenly fell to the ground. Anne dropped her flowers and ran to help Marilla. They tried everything together, but it was too late. Matthew was dead. Anne hugged Marilla and began to sob. The doctor came a little later, and "He had a heart attack," he said.
"Letter!"
cried Anne. She wiped her tears with her hand and read the letter.
"Oh, God!"
she said.
"The church bank has gone bankrupt! All your money and Matthew's is gone!"
Marilla put her head in her hands and began to cry. "This is why my poor brother died!" Everyone in Avonlea was sorry to hear that Matthew was dead. Almost all the villagers attended the funeral. Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 9. After Matthew died, his work on the farm fell to Marilla and Anne. For the next few weeks, they both worked hard on the farm and at home. Everyone in Avonlea was very kind to them and came to their aid from time to time. One day, nearly 2 months later, Marilla said, "I'm going to miss you when you go to Redmond College, Anne." Then she added, "And what will other Avonlea students do?" "Some will teach and some will stay at Queen's." "Gilbert is going to teach at Avonlea School, right?" Anne didn't answer, so Marilla continued. "He has become a tall and handsome boy. He looks like the younger version of his father, John. You know, John and I were very good friends years ago." Anne raised her head with interest. "Then what happened?" "Well, we had a fight about something. He wanted us to be friends again, but I couldn't forgive him. I got upset later, but he never spoke to me again. Maybe well, that was a long time ago." Anne thought of Gilbert. She wished she had given him a chance. The next day, Marilla went to the doctor. She looked very tired and sick when she came back. "What did the doctor say?" Anne asked worriedly. "He says I shouldn't read and write and that I should wear glasses. That is the only way. But if I'm not careful, I will be blind in 6 months." Anne was very upset by this. Marilla no longer had money, and she was old. Moreover, her health was not good. How was she going to leave her? As Anne silently thought about this, Marilla said, "I'm so glad you have a scholarship to Redmond College, because I'm broke now. I guess I'll have to sell this farm and move in with Rachel Lynde." That night, Anne sat alone in the bedroom. She thought for a while, and then she smiled. She knew what to do when she lay on the bed. The next day, she explained it all to Marilla. "You can't sell Green Gables. It's our home. Listen, I've planned everything. I don't go to Redmond College. It's too far. I will teach in one of the village schools near here. Then I can live there during the week and come home on the weekends to take care of you. Diana's father will use our fields and pay us for them. So we'll have some money. Do you understand?" "Oh, Anne, how can you do that? You studied hard and got a good school. I cannot agree to that," said Marilla. "Redmond College doesn't matter," laughed Anne. "I will study at home in the evenings, and I will be a great teacher. This is the best of all." Marilla nodded and tried not to cry. "You're a good girl, Anne." Anne of Green Gables, Chapter 10. A few days later, Rachel Lynde arrived at the farm. "Do you know that Gilbert will no longer be an Avonlea teacher?" she said.
"Isn't he?" cried Anne. "But why?"
"When he heard that you wanted to be near Marilla, he decided to teach at a school in another village, so you can be the Avonlea teacher."
"Ah," said Anne, surprised. That's a very kind gesture."
And when she saw Gilbert by the river that day, she stopped him and held out her hand.
"Gilbert,"
she said timidly,
"I want to thank you. You are very kind. If I become an Avonlea teacher, I can help Marilla a lot more at home."
"I'd be happy to help you, Anne," said Gilbert. He smiled and held her hand tightly. "Are we going to be friends now? Did you forgive me for calling you Carrot?" Anne laughed.
"I forgave you a long time ago."
"I'm sure we'll be very good friends, Anne. Can I walk home with you?" When Anne walked into the Green Gables kitchen, Marilla said, "You look so happy, Anne. Was it Gilbert who was with you just now?"
"Yes," Anne replied, and her face reddened. "Gilbert and I have decided to be friends. Oh, Marilla, I think life will be beautiful for all of us. We will have to work hard, but we will be happy, and we will keep our Green Gables. What could be better than this?"
The end.